Welcome to Dates and Dead Guys. Hundreds of years ago, a people who were kicked down and brutalized turned around their entire civilization. Their use of the bow, paired with the mobility of the horse as well as a savage disposition, made them among the most feared and powerful people in the pre-modern world. But am I talking about the Mongols or the Comanche? Every time I've talked about the Comanche on this channel, people always like to leave comments about how they remind them of the Mongols. So it could be both. Some of the similarities between these two get a little freaky. The geography, cultures, the weaponry, the cruelty. Let's find out what it's like to be the greatest horse archers in history. But before we get to our story, today's video was sponsored by CuriosityStream. CuriosityStream is your ticket to exclusive, mind-blowing documentaries you won't find anywhere else. They have a deep library of content, spanning science, history, nature, and anything else you could possibly want. They truly have something for everyone. Naturally, like you, I love history. They have documentaries that cover both the Mongols and the Wild West, which, if you're a fan of my channel, is right up your alley. But I have other interests. I love animal documentaries, and I have a childlike fascination with dinosaurs. My wife thinks it's weird, but CuriosityStream has me covered. Plans start at under $5 a month, and that's if you pay monthly. They have annual deals that cut that in half. That's under $30 a year. There are some service bundles now that want to charge you that every month. You know the one. That mouse is getting greedy. CuriosityStream is worth it too. They have new releases every week, so you will never run out of fascinating stories to check out. And you can watch anywhere. Laptop, TV, phone, whatever works for you. You can even download videos on the go if you're going to be stuck without internet. On face value, it's worth it, but I have a deal for you. To get unlimited access to the world's top documentaries and nonfiction series, go to curiositystream.com/datesanddead or scan the QR code and begin to fuel your curiosity. Use promo code DATESANDDEAD and you'll receive another 25% off. You'll also find the link in the video description below. I would like to thank CuriosityStream for sponsoring today's video, and let's get to our story. When we look at the Mongols and the Comanche and their reigns of power, it's strange how similar they are despite being separated by continents and hundreds of years. Genghis Khan rose to power by unifying the nomadic tribes of the Mongolian steppe in the early 1200s AD. It wasn't done peacefully. Civil wars were involved, and in doing so, he was able to raise armies and conquer the single largest contiguous empire in world history. The Comanche were not even a notable tribe, let alone powerful in North America until 500 years later. But like the Mongols, their rise from obscurity to dominant power happened fast. And for both, it would have been impossible without the horse and probably where they lived. Geographies shape culture. If you were going to imagine a perfect place to have a mounted army on horseback, what would that environment look like? Would you pick mountains or forests, deserts or grasslands? If you picked grasslands, you're probably right. So, a follow-up question. What are you looking at right now? Is this the Mongolian steppe or the American Great Plains? They're difficult to tell apart, at least for me. The environments are largely interchangeable, but also harsh. The reason that the Eurasian steppe and the American Great Plains are grasslands and not forests is due to the levels of rainfall too low to support trees. There are natural consequences to not having a lot of water, but there are other serious limitations. There are little building materials and little cover for hot summers and bitter winters. So why live in these environments at all? Well, plains offer grazing lands for horses. Some horses are better suited for harsh conditions than others. American Mustangs and Mongolian horses are small and rugged, by horse standards, but they thrive in these kind of environments. The cultures of the Mongols and the Comanche were developed around them. They were even built into their economy. How many horses you had was a sign of your wealth. Being nomadic, accumulating wealth is difficult because you live by moving around from place to place, but horses move with you. On top of their obvious usefulness, they make sense as currency. But the steppe and Great Plains are not just grazing lands. They're basically highways. They allowed their riders to cover unreal amounts of land in a single day. When I say unreal, I mean it. Historians have a hard time piecing together just how many war parties were active at certain times. Traditional accounts, separated by more than 100 miles, report attacks in the same day or within a couple days. Population numbers were likely inflated, because it was thought that it must have been different groups of Comanche or Mongols conducting the attacks, when it was just the same guys moving around. They would often bring several mounts with them on war parties. When the horse they were riding got tired, they would switch out for a fresher one. and their mobility made it hard for their enemies to locate them. That was a big issue with the US military and the Mexicans in their fighting with the Comanche. When they wanted to find them, they never could. As nomads, both groups would move from place to place, living seasonally in advantageous locations. Their housing was designed to take advantage of their lifestyle. Both the Comanche teepee and the Mongolian yurt were transportable, a silver lining when your geography doesn't provide abundant building materials. Women were also in charge of moving them. The men had warring to do, which of course they did, fully mounted. George Catlin, an American artist who spent time with the Comanche, is famous for illustrating their prowess on horseback. He wrote about their skill, demonstrating how they might even shield their bodies by hanging off the side of the horse, suspended by their heel and shooting under the neck. The chief weapon of both the Mongols and the Comanche was the bow. They didn't just ride horses for mobility, they were deadly archers while they moved. Warriors would fire arrows, perfectly timed for when a running horse had all of its legs off the ground. This would ensure a perfectly aimed shot without any bounce. Accounts of both the steppe peoples and the Comanche claim that they were clumsy on foot, but that on horseback they were essentially reborn into masters of war. Catlin wrote of the Comanche, quote, "On their feet, they are one of the most unattractive and slovenly-looking races of Indians I've ever seen. But the moment they mount their horses, they seem at once metamorphosized. I am ready, without hesitation, to pronounce the Comanches the most extraordinary horsemen I have seen yet in my travels." End quote. They were both put into a saddle at a very early age and given a bow in childhood. But the bows were a little different. The Comanche used a long bow made out of orange osage, while the Mongols made a composite bow with a core of hardwood or bamboo. It was backed with sinew and the horn was glued to the belly. I love the Comanche bow. I am actually making one myself. I want to try to shoot like they did. If you are interested in a video on it, let me know in the comments, and maybe that's a project I'll push forward. The Mongol bow, however, is a different animal. The Osage bows used by the Comanche were enough to bring down big game, like bison and deer, but they often only had a draw weight of around 50 pounds. Mongol bows were commonly twice that, and I have seen claims as high as a 160-pound draw. I can't shoot that. They obviously were well practiced and conditioned for it. As horse archers, the Comanche and Mongol tactics were often similar too. Both groups were famous for a battle maneuver called a feigned retreat, in which they would give their enemy the impression they were winning and then fall back as if they were being defeated. The enemy would pursue, hopeful to keep the rout going. There, the archers would turn around in their saddles and shoot backwards in what's called a Parthian shot. A frustrated enemy continues to pursue. Over time, as planned, they are spread out, drawn into an ambush, and then massacred. Their empires were won on horseback. One Mongol commander is even quoted as saying, "If the horse dies, I die. If it lives, I survive." But the similarities don't end there. It wasn't just that they both used horses and bows on plains. Their societies were built on war, and both were incredibly cruel. Nomadic cultures are materially poor, at least when they are not in power. Constant conflict and warfare are inevitable because resources are scarce. These are raiding societies. They take from those around them, often creating blood feuds in the process that lead to greater combat. To not be taken advantage of, you have to be competent as warriors. Genghis Khan himself had to steal back his own wife after she was stolen. That actually plays a big role in Mongol history as their line of succession got muddied a bit. It was pretty clear to everyone that their oldest son, Joki, was probably not actually his son, according to math. We see a similar thing with the Comanche and their most famous chief, Quanah Parker. His mother, Cynthia Ann Parker, was a settler who was captured by the Comanche. It is one of the most famous Indian captive stories in American history. But raiders don't just take women. Taking and keeping land was important, whether it be grazing land for horses or prime bison territory in the Great Plains. Raiding was a way to provide for your people. As a warrior, it granted you status. The societies were organized around it. They also made others pay tribute and provide for them the crops that would make their people do the thing that they despised the most: farm. The Mongols and Comanche hated farming. At one point, the Mongols even debated wiping out a massive portion of the Chinese peasantry because they could turn those useless farms back into grazing land for their horses. The warrior portion of their culture was not something that left them. Modern societies view their own actions of cruelty as wrong. At least we tried to in America. But the Comanche and Mongols at the time of their power were not very many generations removed from being the ones with the boot on their neck. Their cultures were not ones that took mercy. They were meant to wage war, and did so brutally. It's hard to stand out this way among history, but these two do. Author T.R. Fehrenbach makes the claim that in Comanche culture, there was no greater sign of bravery than to withstand torture. As such, the Comanche would commonly put their captives to the test. He provides an example of the level of cruelty. It also demonstrates the Comanche comfort with it. Quote, "A Spanish recorded description of the mass torture of a number of captured Tonkawas is enough to show why the subject of torture was always close to the minds of whites on the Amerindian frontier. In this case, the Comanche warriors staked out their victims and began applying fire to each of the captives' hands and feet until the nerves had been destroyed in each extremity. Then they amputated the ruined extremities and began the fire torture again against the sensitive bleeding flesh. All of the victims were scalped alive, so that they would know the full extent of their degradation. Finally, tiring of the business, the Comanche tore out the Tonkawas' tongues to silence their cries, and heaped the writhing victims' scrota and bellies with the blazing coals. The Comanche then went to sleep around the torture fire." End quote. I will follow that up with an equally troubling excerpt from S.E. Gwen's Empire of the Summer Moon. He writes the Comanche, quote, "Not only did they inflict horrific suffering, but by all evidence, they enjoyed it. Making people scream in pain was fun for them. It was an important part of their adult culture, and one they accepted without challenge." End quote. As for the Mongols, the best examples, I think, are the ones based on scale and nobility. The Mongols were famous for giving cities an opportunity to surrender before they would lay siege, something that they were much better at than the Comanche. If the city surrendered, they would have to pay tribute to the Khans, but they would usually be allowed to live. But if they didn't surrender, and the Mongols had to lay siege, they would kill everyone in the city when they did it. It became mathematic. The survivors would be divided between soldiers to be executed. To keep count, the executioner would cut off an ear so that they could tally the dead, which is efficient because the scale of murders was often in the tens of thousands, sometimes higher. It feels more intentional than the practice of taking scalps, but it serves an adjacent purpose. It's a signal for how many they've killed. The Mongols also had a weird taboo about shedding noble blood. If a person who was to be executed was of perceived nobility, from a rival clan or foreign kings, they wouldn't kill them with swords or arrows. They would wrap them in a blanket and trample them with horses to avoid angering the gods by spilling noble blood on the ground. I don't want to get too far into the weeds here, but if you want a specific example, you can look up the aftermath of the Battle of Klina River. The Mongols didn't want to shed the blood of Russian princes, so they built a platform, rested it on the princes, and had dinner on top of them to suffocate them slowly as they celebrated their victory. There are several versions of this quote, but Genghis Khan is reported to have said something to the effect of, "A man's greatest work is to break his enemies, to drive them before him, to take from them all the things that have been theirs, to hear the weeping of those who cherish them, to take their horses between his knees and press in his arms the most desirable of their women." This is the part where most articles and textbooks will emphasize how the Mongols also facilitated trade and were tolerant of other religions. If you are like me, at this point it must have run across your mind at least once. The Mongols and Comanche are similar. But what would happen if they fought? No Mongol had ever heard of any Comanche. They would have been aliens to each other, but also like a long-lost relative. In the end, if these two cultures were to have made contact, there for sure would have been a fight. I wish I could tell you this would have been epic, but in reality it probably wouldn't have been very competitive. The Mongols take it pretty easily. Despite the similarities, they have some significant advantages. I'll take a look at the idea in two ways: the civilizations as they were, or if equal forces were facing off. The first one is our best army against your best army. Numbers alone disqualify the Comanche. At the time of Genghis Khan's death, he commanded in the neighborhood of 130,000 soldiers. That is more than 10 times the entire Comanche population of the 1800s. Not warriors, total people. The Spanish in the late 1700s thought there might have been as many as 30,000, but they moved fast in a time where most people didn't, and the numbers were exaggerated, but it was probably under 10,000 total. The scale at which the Mongols could operate was absurd. In 1258, the Mongols sacked Baghdad, Contemporary accounts put the deaths at around 800,000 people, but some historians think there was more, because they didn't count all the children that drowned. That is far from the only example of mass operations. The Comanche couldn't do anything like that, nor would they. They made it a point to only fight from advantageous positions. But then what about a force of equal size, or fighting one-on-one? The idea of a fight between the two was actually done years ago on a show called The Deadliest Warrior. I watched it as part of research for this episode. They said the Comanche would win, but they were wrong. They ran tests with subjective results, like an archery contest, and they largely ignored the role of armor and organization of the Mongols. Throughout the reign of the Khans, their military organization was far more advanced than what we typically see in Native American groups. They were highly organized and structured. They had units based around the number 10, with leadership in every progressing role. Their soldiers were promoted on merit and their loyalty to the Khan, and there were punishments in place for not performing. They learned to conduct complex sieges with weaponry beyond the scope of typical horse archers. They carried out long operations. Indian raids didn't operate that way. They were choosy on when and where they would fight, and for good reason. With small populations, they couldn't afford to lose people. It takes nearly 2 decades to replace them. Only one, if you are good at kidnapping and brainwashing. Even as individual warriors, I like the edge that the Mongol armor gives, and the bows with greater draw strength. As riders, I don't think I could give an edge to one or the other. Both lived on horseback. The Mongol armor wouldn't have been perfect, but it would have offered better protection than the Comanche buffalo hide shields. And their bows also gave them better range. So what about stealthier operations? These are both horse tribes. Any meaningful conflict would have been fought that way, and the Comanche were well known for their lack of stealth in battle. They were loud and brash, giving off war whoops and painting themselves for intimidation. Groups like the Apache were great with stealth, but that wasn't the way for the Comanche, at least not in war. But maybe I'm wrong, so feel encouraged to tell me what you think in the comments. I'm also curious who in the ancient world could have taken on a well-organized group of horse archers. Could the Macedonian armies of Alexander have taken on Genghis Khan? How would a force of 100 legionaries fare against the Comanche on the Great Plains? I don't know, but you might have thoughts. This is a fun comparative episode, and there is a lot unturned here, but let's wrap this up. For all their similarities, the Mongols and Comanche even had some of the same problems. Both cultures struggled with alcohol, and modern firearms undo a lot of the advantages of horse archers. But for generations, for anyone on the periphery of the steppe or the plains, the name of the Mongol or the Comanche were the thing of nightmares. Thanks for watching the video. I hope that you enjoyed it and you come back to check out some of the other ones on the channel. If you have any questions, comments, or ideas for future videos, please send them in, and we'll hopefully get to all those.